Boruto has finally entered the battlefield, which means that his predestined fate of dying at the hands of Jura is now upon us. Though of course Boruto is also the main character, so naturally he wouldn't be dying at this point in the story. So the real question is why? Why does Boruto survive this event if he's predestined to die? Well, I believe this goes back to Toneri's prophecy that the gods would descend upon the land, which will also trigger Boruto's Jougan. Now at that point in the story, we thought he was referring to the Otsutsuki, but what if that wasn't the case? What if the gods Toneri prophesied would descend upon the land was the Shinju beings themselves? To understand why this makes perfect sense, I first need to explain why it definitely wasn't referring to the Otsutukis, which is actually quite easy. This goes back to the original premise of the prophecy itself, which is that the gods will descend upon the land. Toneri said this in episode 15 after seeing that the gate Nue opened has now been sealed. This prophecy was then later referenced again in episode 53 when Toneri first met Urashiki on the moon. He said, and I quote, "You finally arrived, celestial being." This means that Toneri initially thought that Urashiki was the entity from his prophecy since he said that he has finally arrived. But this is where it gets somewhat interesting. You see, Urashiki then says, "Why stand on formality? We're from the same clan." Toneri then replied by saying that he thought the fate of the Otsutsuki clan would end with him. What this simply means is that Toneri thought he was the last remaining Otsutsuki, so it can't also be the case that he thought the clan would descend upon the land. In fact, after Urashiki replied saying that the main family of the clan doesn't feel that way, Toneri replied in confusion, asking if they still existed. Why did they forsake us for over 1,000 years? So not only was he not referring to the main branch of the Otsutsuki, he didn't even think they still existed. Which is why he once again replied in confusion when Toneri said that we were dispatched, referring to Momoshiki and Kinshiki. So what this means is that even though the Otsutsukis are self-proclaimed gods, they aren't the gods Toneri anticipated. Now notice that I said self-proclaimed, which would mean in a sense that they could be demigods in the context of the Naruto universe, but they aren't the only beings in this universe that were referred to as gods. You see, during my research for this video, which required me to read a good portion of the Fourth Great War once again, I noticed that Kurama said that the Ten Tails was the beginning of chakra and the creator god of many nations. Now just to clarify, this isn't Kurama, another Biju, making a baseless claim to prop his species. This information was relayed to him by Hagoromo Otsutsuki as stated in chapter 594. What this means is that Mr. Hagoromo knew more about the Ten Tails than we initially thought, and that information has not been revealed to the audience as yet. By the way, he also said that the Ten Tails was the progenitor that was said to have created this very land, which means that the Ten Tails is that which created the planets themselves. Now this might seem a tad bit contradictory since, as explained by Mr. Amado, Otsutsukis always utilize a Ten Tails when assaulting a planet because the Ten Tails is that which becomes the divine tree. The Ten Tails is actually a seedling they first plant into the ground, which then grows into the divine tree and consumes the planet, thus bearing a chakra fruit. In fact, he even stated that you can't just bury the Ten Tails in the soil and add water for it to become a divine tree. There's one special condition that must be met, that being you must feed a living Otsutsuki to the Ten Tails. That is why the Otsutsukis travel in pairs, because one must be fed to the Ten Tails, while the next one procures the fruit it creates. So can it be the case that the Ten Tails is the god that created the planet, but you also need to plant a Ten Tail seedling to absorb the life of the planet? Well, the funny thing about that is that even though I said it in a way where it sounds like it shouldn't make sense, it actually makes perfect sense. Now, I'm not sure if you guys ever read Marvel Comics, but I mentioned this in my Toneri video, but it's also relevant here, so I'm gonna mention it here again. You see, there are beings in this universe called the Celestials that actually operate in a similar fashion to that of the Ten Tails, in that they're responsible for the creation of the planets that they themselves later consume. This is done by planting embryos in the core of a planet, which then goes on to absorb the energy from the planet itself and its inhabitants until it grows big enough to destroy it. These Celestials are also responsible for the super-powered individuals having powers in the first place by slightly altering their genetic structure. This of course would mirror what Hagoromo did by transferring the chakra Kaguya took from the Ten Tails to the humans, which is what gave him the ability to use jutsus. Now of course this isn't a one-to-one, but you can see the clear references. Also, Yggdrasil is known as the World Tree in the Marvel Universe, that which is responsible for the creation of the 9 realms. Again, a clear nod to the God Tree in Naruto, which is just another form of the Ten Tails. And also the 9 realms created by the World Tree being a clear reference to the 9 Biju created from the God Tree. So it could be the case that there is a main divine tree in the Naruto universe that is responsible for the creation of the universe itself along with the planets that inhabit said universe. That would explain why the Ten-Tailed Seedling possesses the ability to absorb a planet's life force, since it is that which spawned it into existence in the first place. Now again, this isn't going to be a one-to-one copy of Norse mythology or anything, or the Marvel universe, since it could be the case that the Ten-Tails that was initially on the planet was the one that created the planet, which would mean that each planet naturally has a Ten-Tails built into it. Though there is this statement which said that an Otsutsuki created the current world likely using omnipotence, which might seem like a contradiction, and it could be, but it could also be the case that the Otsutsuki created the Ten-Tails and used it to create the planet, or even created the planet with the Ten-Tails inside. That way it could amass chakra over time, similar to the Celestials. That would also explain why Kaguya's servant said that the God Tree had been there for over several millennia, which means that it was likely planted a long time ago or was always there. So similar to how the Celestials created these planets and the new universe, then used their seedlings to feed off the energy humans generated, that could be the same motive behind the Ten-Tails as well. Now the role of the Otsutsuki in this is quite fascinating, since it could also be the case that they play the role of the deviants from Marvel Comics. These guys were said to have been created as a delicacy to be consumed by the Celestials, which would be similar to how the Otsutsukis are consumed by the Ten-Tails. Though it was later revealed or retconned into existence that the Deviants along with the Eternals were created by the Celestials to protect the Celestial Seedling while it absorbed the energy of the planet, which is also very similar to how Kaguya said that it was her job to watch over the Divine Tree. By the way, this could also just be one big coincidence, or maybe I'm onto something. Now the evolution the Ten-Tailed Seedling underwent is currently being portrayed as a new occurrence in this universe, and Boruto only knows about it because of Kashin Koji's prescience, but we truly know nothing about the Ten-Tails and what its true background is. There's no point in making any definitive statements about what is the true evolutionary process, especially since, as I pointed out in one of my videos on Boruto resurrecting Kaguya, for some reason there were never any records of a beast running around on the planet, not until Kaguya herself merged with the Ten-Tails. The sage himself initially believed that the reason why the Ten-Tails went on a rampage was due to it being robbed of its chakra fruit, referring to the fruit that Kaguya had consumed. However, Black Zetsu later revealed that the Ten-Tails wasn't just the Divine Tree, it was Kaguya herself as well. So it wasn't the Divine Tree trying to reclaim its chakra fruit, but Kaguya's will attempting to take back the chakra that had been dispersed into her 2 children. So this somewhat explains why, instead of gradually absorbing the chakra of the planet and all living things, the Ten-Tails became aggressive and more obvious. It was influenced by the will of Kaguya, who had once merged with it. In fact, the Ten-Tails spoke to Madara during the war, which means that even the original Ten-Tails showed signs of sentience. So what Code did, which led to the creation of the Shinju, isn't really unique, but again, more information is required. Now what's also interesting is the mention of the Jougan back in episode 15, which I mentioned before. Toneri said that the Jougan's turn won't be coming up for a while, and that was prior to him saying that the gods would descend upon the land. So this simply means that the gods arriving is linked to the Jougan's resurgence, or the first reveal for the manga canon deniers, even though it was literally shown in chapter 1. Also, a lot of people missed this, but in one of V-Jump's covers, we see Boruto sitting on this bluish circular rock that heavily resembles the moon's surface. And what we know from Naruto the Last, which is confirmed to be canon to Naruto's franchise, Toneri decided to remain on the moon. So one could take this to mean that Toneri might play an important part in Boruto's current storyline, and it would make sense since again it ties back into the gods would descend upon the land storyline and also the Jougan's resurgence. So even if one wants to keep denying that the Jougan is canon, even though it's shown in the anime, it is literally also mentioned in the novels featuring Toneri, the same Toneri who is canon to the main continuity. And as I mentioned earlier, the Jougan was literally shown in chapter 1. It's not a Byakugan. They simply just changed the design for the anime, which came after the manga. It is still the same silver eye that was mentioned in the novels. In either case, Shonen Jump's editor-in-chief said that the manga and anime are 2 distinct blocks that choose to take different paths and then intersect at the same point in the end. So while Toneri assisted Boruto with awakening the Jougan in both continuities, the difference is that he simply did it much earlier in the anime continuity. So the endpoint of Toneri helping Boruto to awaken the Jougan remains the same, but how they get to that point just manifests differently in both continuities, in my opinion. So in a sense, I think Boruto will awaken the Jougan, and that will allow him to defy his current fated destiny to die at the hands of Jura. They could simply say that Kashinkoji wasn't able to see the Jougan in his multiple calculations of the future because the Jougan is exempt from this power because of some anime nonsense science. Who knows? They have to do something, because if Boruto simply just survives for no reason, if Momoshiki comes out or if Kawaki arrives, then it's gonna feel anticlimactic, because Kashinkoji should have been able to see that happening, which would have, of course, informed his decisions. So Boruto defined this fate that has been hinted at so many times in Blue Vortex has to be for some extraordinary reason for it to feel impactful. And I think the best way to do that would be to use the Jougan, because it's also something that has been hinted at in the past and we don't know the capabilities of it, so I guess we'll see. With that said, let me know your thoughts down below. Do you think there's a better way to do this, or do you think the Jougan would be the best way to, solve this situation? If you guys also liked the video, drop a like down below, and also if you guys want to learn more about the Naruto Boruto universe, watch one of the 2 videos on screen.